Have you guys heard about the recent WNBA discourse? Yeah, apparently hecklers in the crowd at games of the women's NBA have taken to throwing dildos onto the court during play, generally bright green ones, in order to make them stand out to the cameras.
Something flies on the court, actually, from the crowd.
Here's how this all started. For years now, the conversation with regards to women's professional sports has focused on how little they're paid in comparison to men's professional sports. Feminist advocates, as well as the female athletes themselves, often chalk this up to misogyny.
How do you guys feel about that when you see the astronomical numbers that the NBA players make versus the pay grade that happens in the WNBA?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and a lot of us, we obviously play for the passion and love for the game. A lot of women play 2 seasons, going over season or off season, playing and then playing in the WNBA as well. So you could argue that we have a longer season and put in, equal work. But we got a lot to do. We understand that. A lot of our naysayers are people that disparage women in sports in general, and we understand that as well.
The common rebuttal is that it's just capitalism. Less people watch women's sports as compared to men's, which means less interest, less eyeballs on screens, less eyeballs watching advertisements, and therefore less money coming in. Female athletes get paid less because their performances just aren't deemed to be as valuable by the audience. The counter argument is that the reason they're not deemed as valuable is also due to misogyny. That's probably at least a little bit true, but it's also pretty clear that if you watch, for example, the WNBA, the players just aren't as good at the sport of basketball than the players over at the NBA are. In those sports where women actually do perform exceptionally, like in gymnastics or figure skating, female athletes in those domains tend to also be a lot more financially successful. Of course, the feminist reply is that those are considered to be traditionally feminine sports, and it's misogyny once again. But maybe they're considered feminine sports because it's females who excel at them. This is a chicken and egg question. Anyway, although this discourse has been rehashed many times over the years, it came to a head in March of 2025. The WNBA Players Union was renegotiating their contract, and the players were making a big show about asking for more. On the 8th, a statement by Angel Reese, a player in the league, went viral after she proclaimed on a podcast that they were ready to go on strike if things didn't go their way.
The ones coming this year will still be on the rookie contract again. The ones that the year after, they're gonna get more. They probably gonna be making more than us.
No, they are.
I'm hurt.
They are. Yeah. I've been in the meetings. They are.
I need to get in the. I need to get in the field.
You need to come to the
I
meeting.
gotta get in the meetings because I'm hearing they don't give us. If y'all don't give us what we want, we sitting out.
That's a possibility.
And to their credit, if there ever was a time to do this, it would be right now. Despite the lackluster performance of the WNBA compared to the NBA, in terms of both quality of play and profitability, the WNBA is actually at an all-time high. If there was ever a moment to negotiate a better contract for its players, now is it. Their current contract comes to an end in October of 2025, and even back in 2024 it was expected that the WNBA players would spend 2025 trying to negotiate themselves into a better position. Nothing so far is unreasonable or unexpected. However, this discourse hit the internet mainstream in late July, when, as a part of their bargaining tactics, WNBA players began to hit the court all wearing the same t-shirt, with "Pay us what you owe us" printed on the front. This was treated as a feminist slogan, a rallying cry of equal pay for equal work. Now, maybe they are being paid less than they should be, considering the league's growing popularity. Maybe not. That's something they have to work out in negotiation. But the slogan on the t-shirt is kind of presumptuous, and I'm not the only one who thought so. The internet absolutely dogpiled these women, which is frankly completely expected. It is the internet, nothing new here. The WNBA has been a go-to punching bag for a while, both online and off.
And at the top of the second half, it's 16-9. Easton leads the scoring with 4.
And that's why she commands $7,000 a year. These gals sure do make it look difficult.
But is having this minor skill worth being so unattractive? That's for the fan to decide. Yay!
However, things escalated really quick when people began to start throwing dildos onto the basketball court during play. During that first instance, which I showed at the beginning of the video, they didn't initially know that it was a dildo, but they figured it out pretty quick.
No room for any of that type of activity. Yeah, and no one's picked the object up yet. You guys, oh my gosh, okay.
Over the next few days, multiple other WNBA games saw dildos of varying shapes, sizes, and colors tossed onto the court during play. Another player, Sophie Cunningham, tweeted out, "Stop throwing dildos in the court, you're gonna hurt one of us," which was quite prophetic, considering she got hit with the next one. And, of course, all of the internet memesters came out with their best offerings. This is the sort of flash-in-the-pan meme that would have died out had they just left it alone, but the WNBA announced they would begin to do mandatory bag checks at all games from then on. At that point, the meme shifted into describing creative ways to smuggle the dildos into the games. Which, yes, means a bunch of jokes about dudes shoving dildos up their asses in order to bypass security. Hey, this is better than the guy who wore his metal butt plug in a fucking MRI. Of course, the players in the WNBA don't like being treated as a joke. They never have. And fair enough. To them, this was just another example in a long line of examples of them being disrespected. Cunningham had this to say about it over on her own podcast.
So it's rubber. It's not going to scan on the like metal detector thing. So if someone threw it and it landed on the suction part, like and just like on the floor, could you imagine? Or the backboard, like
Tim out.
That would be crazy.
Everyone's trying to like make sure like the W is like not a joke and it's taken seriously, and then that happens. I'm like, how are we ever gonna get taken seriously if we have freaking?
But in a way, pro sports
toys.
have had like crazy streakers and people doing weird stuff. This is like part of the
1,000%.
course. You know?
Honestly, I'd much rather a dildo than a streaker.
You know, it sounds like she's taken it a lot more lightheartedly than the viral headline implied. But you know who isn't? The coaches. One of them was clearly taking this very seriously, claiming the action of tossing dildos wasn't just benign disruption, it was an overt act of sexualization designed to keep women down.
Things onto the court. Obviously, you guys know what the object is. And I just want to comment on, this has been going on for centuries. The sexualization of women. This is the latest version of that. And it's not funny. And it should not be the butt of jokes on any radio shows, or in print, or in any comments.
Yeah, I don't know about that one, Chief. It just looks like trolls being little shits to me. And in fact, 2 of those little shits ended up getting arrested. A 23-year-old guy for disorderly conduct, public indecency, and trespass, and an 18-year-old guy for battery because the dildo he threw hit another audience member in the head. It's at this point that a cryptocurrency group called Green Dildo Coin took responsibility for some of the events, claiming they had begun tossing the green dildos onto the court as a way to get publicity for their upcoming meme coin, and the whole thing had gotten out of hand after the initial event went viral. Whoops. As funny as all of this actually is, the real problem here is twofold. Firstly, with regards to the pay us what you owe us shit, not all work is equal. Even if we assume WNBA players practice just as much and play just as hard as NBA players, the value of their labor is still ultimately dictated by the market. How hard you work is only one variable. This is the problem with the labor theory of value, by the way. Oftentimes, Marxists will lean heavily on the LTV, even though Marx himself never actually spoke about it. But pretty much everyone in the Marxist camp nowadays loves it, from online randoms to educated professors. The labor theory of value basically says that the value of a product is determined by the total amount of labor necessary to produce it. So for example, let's say you're selling tables. You can calculate how much labor time was used to create the table. You got the time spent building the table. You've got materials like wood and nails, but those are also products that have been created by labor time, to cut down trees and shape them into usable wood, to mine the metal and shaping it into usable nails. And then you've got your tools, which are also created by labor time, and which slowly get used up by wear and tear. And then there are other forms of labor time that also add to the product in a less direct way, like quality control or advertising or shipping or whatever. These things aren't necessary to build the table, but they are necessary to sell the table. Since we can actually math out how much labor was spent to create the table in total, according to the labor theory of value, that is the table's value. And if the table is sold at market for a higher price, the difference between the two numbers is the surplus, which Marxists believe is being stolen by the capitalist class, due to them owning the business and not actually providing any labor to it. The issue with the labor theory of value isn't that it's incorrect, rather that it's incomplete. The labor theory of value accurately describes the supply side of economics. You know, how much it costs to bring a product to market. The problem is that it simply assumes the demand side, how much the customer wants to pay for that product, should be made the same as the supply side, for moral reasons. The worker deserves the money of the buyer by virtue of the fact that he's a worker, and Marxists value workers as a class, more so than buyers. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. If the buyer doesn't value what's being sold, at least at the rate the worker's selling it at, then the buyer doesn't have to buy it. This is the mud pie critique of the labor theory of value. Let's say I got a wheelbarrow full of mud, and I spent tons of labor hours crafting the best mud pie, and I tried to sell it. Who the fuck wants that? Actually, there are some cultures that literally eat mud cake, so fair enough. But the argument's the same. In that culture, there's a demand for that product. If I make mud pies in an area where there's no demand for mud pies, it doesn't matter how much of my labor I've sunk into the product. No one's gonna buy it. The LTV might accurately model the supply side of an exchange, but it has nothing to say about the demand side, beyond a moral claim that it shouldn't matter, which is why it's incomplete. So when the WNBA players say, pay us what you owe us, there's not some intrinsic sell value to their labor that must be aligned with the amount of labor hours they've put into their product, which is ultimately the games they play. No, how desirable their product is to their audience is also a variable. Now, if you think this video is only shitting on WNBA players for being naive, then you haven't been watching this channel nearly long enough. You gotta know by now, I really enjoy my high ground on the fence. And that brings us to our second problem with the green dildo discourse. The political dimensions of this story pretty cleanly fall into a conflict between feminists and vaguely right-leaning trolls. After all, I don't see progressives or socialists, or other types of leftists, throwing green dildos onto the WNBA court. Meanwhile, the types of people who are actually laughing at this event are vaguely right-leaning trolls. I'm not saying this derisively, by the way. I'm not doing like a, oh, look at those evil rightoids. It's just a fact. Most people getting involved in this discourse, by laughing at how ridiculous the whole thing is, are at least somewhat right-leaning. At least some of these accounts call themselves MAGA, in fact. I'm laying this out to point out the fact that, in general, the right wing just doesn't really care all that much about the integrity of women's sports. They usually ignore their existence most of the time. But when they do come up, they view them as objects of derision, utterly dwarfed by their male counterparts, due to the difference in sales numbers and views and skill at the sport. To put it simply, right-wingers don't think about women's sports at all, and the few times they do, it's to make a joke about how lackluster they are. And yes, those jokes are pretty funny sometimes. But with all that being said, I was previously under the impression that the right wing actually viewed the integrity of women's sports as an extremely serious political issue, at least when it came to keeping trans women out of them. From like 2018 until 2024, right-wing accounts online constantly posted about trans women infiltrating and invading women's sports. Right-wing talking heads on the internet, or even on mainstream news sometimes, devoted a significant amount of airtime to how these failed male athletes were transitioning and dominating women's sports, enjoying the full advantages of having gone through a male puberty. And you know what? The right-wingers were correct. I did a video a few years back going over the actual scientific data on the topic, but here's the basics. One of the studies I looked at noted that some of the difference can be explained by females not participating in sports or other rigorous physical activity nearly as often as males. Looking over the data from multiple times and locations shows that as more women became physically active, the gap in ability did actually shrink somewhat, but that's only part of the difference. The study concluded that the majority of the difference in physical ability between males and females was biological. The study went on to show just how much of an advantage male biology affords over females, ranging from a 10% advantage in rowing, swimming, or track running, up to a 50% advantage for baseball or field hockey. The study then compared males, females, and trans women who have been on feminizing hormones for 5 years. The black bar shows the physical ability lost by trans women in comparison to men, while the white bar shows the remaining advantage that trans women have over women, even taking into account their black bar losses. Although trans women do lose some of that male advantage, it's not enough to place them on a level playing field with cis women, even after 5 years on hormones. The study concludes that trans women cannot play in women's sports if fairness in the sport is the goal of these various leagues. And during this time period from 2018 to 2024, despite the science on this overwhelmingly pointing in only one direction, progressives kept pushing for trans women in women's sports in the name of inclusivity to the point of total absurdity.
I don't give a shit about the scientific explanations. People, if they identify as a woman, get to compete in sports. If that's not fair in the short term for a variety of little competitions, I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit, because the societal interest of including trans people in society trumps stupid competition. Full stop. So I'm right about this, you're wrong about this.
The right-wing reaction to this was negative and entirely correct. The integrity of women's sports is actually violated by having trans women who have enjoyed a male puberty enter that sport and absolutely dominate it. And the only thing progressives had to say in response to it was to scream about bigotry.
Honestly, like women's sports, it's barely an institution. It's only been around for a few decades. Like if our sources of our outlets for entertainment, for competition, for like, I don't know, however to define them. But if they're not able to accommodate trans people, then they're not worthy of existing.
Eventually, trans women in women's sports began to be rolled back in various leagues and sports here and there. But this is in no way a universal thing. And depending on what we're talking about, I'm not sure it actually has to be. I understand the argument for areas where a male's strength or speed grants a decisive advantage. But for example, for a while there, the rightoids were getting angry about 2 trans women dominating women's pool. Now, it's been a long time since I've played a game of pool, but I'm not sure that male strength or speed makes you better at that particular game. When it comes to stuff like pool or chess or playing cards professionally or whatever, I personally don't give a shit. Get fucking good. However, in physical events where getting good is actually impossible for women, there's real value in keeping women's sports for females only, so that there's actually a place for female excellence in those domains. In a purely open category, men would and do dominate everyone. In a female category that allows trans women would and do dominate everyone. In my opinion, the solution is having categories just for trans people, where appropriate. However, the reason that I'm retreading the trans women and women conversation, even though frankly it's no longer a part of the news cycle, outside of a few rage-baiting rightoid grift accounts, is because the entire logic the right used back during that discourse, that upholding the integrity of women's sports was essential, has now completely fallen apart in the face of at least some of these very same people getting in on the green dildo thing. trans women dominating women's sports, and dude disrupts women's sports by throwing a dildo onto the court are both stories of male interference. And in hindsight, it's pretty obvious the right only cared about the integrity of women's sports insofar as it could be leveraged to attack trans people. Yeah, it is funny that green dildos get tossed onto the court. I appreciate the joke. But once you start to compare the previous opinions these people held about women's sports with what they're saying now, it's pretty obvious they never actually cared about any of this. It was just culture war bullshit the rightoids wanted to win. And by the way, none of this means that I've flipped on my previous position on trans women and women's sports. I still think they should be barred for the good of the sport. It's just obvious to me now that the rightoids never actually cared about the good of the sport. They simply cared about scoring a point over those evil tranners. They just so happened to also be factually correct this time. The right tends to take up blanket anti-trans positions, whether or not they're actually true, in the same way that the left tends to take up pro-trans positions, whether or not they're actually true. And the trans women and women's sports thing is a good example of that. In any case, while the green dildo stuff was pretty funny, I think its moment in the sun has largely passed. The most recent news is that the WNBA Players Union has rejected a 400% pay raise from the league, which seems kind of wild to me, though obviously we're not privy to the negotiations or all the numbers or whatever.
I think we can focus on our players in the union. We got a proposal from the league, which was honestly a slap in the face.
Listen, here's a dev pro tip. You guys want to make this WNBA thing work out? We all know the viewer bump you're currently getting due to memesters watching and waiting for the next green dildo to hit the floor will pass soon enough. So here's what you gotta do. It's real simple. Put these girls in bikinis or sports leggings or something. I promise you, the WNBA will start getting women's volleyball numbers real fucking quick.